Yes, the text. Yeah, but it's on. Oh, now you're. Good afternoon. Welcome. Those in the back, come on forward. It's been a long day, I know, coming into the home stretch. Just a few announcements. I'm Peter Glassman. I'm a volunteer here with the Book Festival. Just a few announcements, and I will introduce David Foster, who will moderate our next session, The Future of Life on Earth, Migration, Immigration, and Climate Change. It's a very sort of small subject. Welcome to the Book Festival. Thank you so much for coming and for supporting the festival. This is a fabulous community event where we can all come together and enjoy this event. The Book Festival is free, but donations are essential to the festival's success. Survival kits, Book Festival water bottles, and great-looking denim book bags here displayed are all available for sale at the information tent. Please be as generous as possible. If you don't need a tote, that's okay. You just give cash. Food is available for sale from Orange Peel Bakery, Mary's Lemonade, the Scottish Bakehouse, Chef Dion Catering, and Chef Amy Johnson's food truck. Please support these food vendors. The authors will take succinct questions from the audience at the end of the discussion. When asking a question, please line up at the microphone toward the side and stand close to the microphone to speak. Authors will be signing books in the book signing tent immediately following the session for about 30 minutes. Please allow them to get to the tent before engaging. The books are available for sale in the adjacent book sales tent. Please buy the authors' books. This is how we support the authors, the book festival, and independent booksellers. Plan ahead for Christmas. At this time, I would like to introduce our moderator, David Foster. Ecologist David Foster is the director of the Harvard Forest, the university's 4,000-acre ecological laboratory and classroom in central Massachusetts. He teaches biology on the Harvard faculty, has a PhD in ecology from the University of Minnesota. His primary focus is on landscape dynamics in New England and understanding the changes in forest ecosystems that result from human and natural disturbance and applying these results to the management of natural and cultural landscapes. He's the author of A Meeting of Land and Sea, Nature and the Future of Martha's Vineyard, which was featured in the Martha's Vineyard Book Festival in 2017. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. David Foster.
Thanks very much, Peter, and thanks to all of you for coming. Earlier today, I had somebody who asked me whether I was worried about being so late in the day, and I said, our topic is the future of life on Earth. And we have phenomenal speakers who have written terrific books that look at this from an environmental and human perspective. I think we'll have a full tent. So the outline for today, I would like to start off by brief introduction of the authors, posing a general question about the challenges that their books articulate in order to give them an opportunity to kind of tee up for you a quick summary of the book and the highlights of it. And then we're going to turn and talk a little bit about where we go from here in terms of solutions and answers to the big challenges that they pose. And then I'm hoping that the authors themselves will have a little bit of conversation and ask each other some questions. And then we'll open it up for, I love the way that Peter articulated it, these very pointed and brief questions from the audience. So Suketu Mehta is a professor of journalism at New York University. He has an earlier book entitled Maximum City, Bombay, Lost and Found, which is a fabulous articulation of that city, and he just told me that he's writing a equally engaging book about New York City. His book is This Land is Our Land, An Immigrant's Manifesto. And then Tatiana Schlossberg has had a variety of positions, New York Times science writer, intern and staff writer for the Vineyard Gazette. She graduated from Yale, where she also has contributed to the Yale Environment 360 publication. And her book is entitled Inconspicuous Consumption, The Environmental Impact You Don't Know You Have. And then finally, we have David Wallace-Wells, who has been working as deputy director of the New York Magazine. He's associated now with the New America Foundation. His book, which is now a bestseller in the New York Times, is entitled The Uninhabitable Earth. And so we have poised here grand migrations, grand movements of people in a reordering of kind of the globe from a cultural perspective, clearly a reordering of the globe from an environmental perspective, both at a grand scale and through the actions of us as individuals, whether we recognize it or not. And so I'd like to start with Suketu and just ask each of the authors to give us a snapshot overview of the big issues that they articulate and what they would like us to take away from today and moving on after you go out and buy their books at the end of the session.
Thank you, David, for that very generous introduction. I said I'm writing a book about New York. I didn't say it would be engaging, but that's left for the critics. I hope it will be. This book, however, is engaging. It's bona fide engaging. It's been, and because it's a book about what I think is the defining human phenomenon of the 21st century, which is migration. So I'm one of 250 million people in the world today who were born in a country other than the one they live in now. I came to the United States, or rather Jackson Heights, Queens, which is sometimes a part of the United States, at the age of 14. And, I've lived here for 40 years, and I've never seen this kind of anti-immigrant sentiment that I'm seeing in the country today, and actually across the globe. So most of the debate about immigration in the West is about, should we let in immigrants? How many should we let in? Should they be skilled or not? It's basically told from the point of the view of the host countries themselves. And I've been thinking, what about the viewpoint of the immigrants, the people who are moving? Why are they moving? It's not because they hate their homes or their families or their language or their cuisine or the trees, the birds of their native land. It's because the rich countries have left them no choice. Through colonialism, war, inequality, and climate change, the West, I maintain, has stolen the future of the rest of the world. And the book begins with an anecdote that my grandfather once told me. So my grandfather was born in India, and he lived in Kenya when it was ruled by the British. And then he retired in England, where his son, my uncle, was living. So my grandfather is sitting in a park one day in North London, minding his own business. And then this elderly British gent comes up to him and wags a finger at him and says, "Why are you here? Why don't you go back to your country?" And my grandfather says, "Because we are the creditors. Because you came to my country, you stole all my gold and my diamonds, so we've come here to collect." He said, we are here because you were there. So in my book, I look at why immigrants are moving, and it's because of these 4 factors: colonialism, war, inequality, and climate change. Why they're feared and hated, and why they should be welcomed. So it's an angry book, but with a happy ending. And and if I'll just give a very brief overview of these 4 things. So, colonialism, and just the numbers tell the story. When the British arrived in India at the beginning of the 18th century, India's share of world GDP was 23%. By 1947, it was under 4%. During the colonial period, the European share of world GDP went from 20% to 60%. Then I look at wars. I mean, we went into Iraq. We launched an illegal and unnecessary war. 600,000 Iraqis lost their lives as a result. And now basically we have a blanket ban on Iraqis coming into this country, even the ones that helped the US forces there in the war, because they happen to be Muslim. Guns. We put 1.8 million guns in Honduras to arm the Contras during the Nicaraguan struggle. We exported the gangs from our prisons, and we buy the one product they have left to sell, which is their drugs. And then we wonder why they're coming to our borders to look for asylum, because we've devastated the countries of Central America, much of Latin America. We've propped up their worst dictators, toppled their democratically elected leaders, so they have no future. Climate change, and David, I'm sure, will talk more about that. But if you think that if Germany is worried about 4 million Syrians coming into the country now because of war, you ain't seen nothing yet. What happens when Bangladesh gets flooded and 40 million Bangladeshis have to find dry land? By the middle of the century, land today that is home to 1.5 billion people will be desert. Land that is home to 650 million people will be underwater. Where are all these people going to go? And who's responsible for climate change? Well, the United States, we're 4% of the world's population, but we put 1/3 of the world's excess carbon into the atmosphere. The EU, another 1/4. We built up our economies, and we put all this stuff up there, which is now decimating the economies of the countries which don't have much to do with the historical emissions of climate change. So basically, I looked at these 4 factors, and with global and inequality within countries and between countries, which is another factor driving migration. I mean, today the 6 richest people on the planet, all men, no surprise, own more than half of the planet, or 3.6 billion people combined. So people are going to move in larger numbers than ever before. It's causing enormous anger and this backlash, which is shaping elections, politics in all these countries. In the United States, immigration has been identified as the single most important issue for voters for the presidential elections. So, whoever gets elected will depend on how people feel about immigration. But the happy ending to my book is when people move, it's good for everyone. It's good for the countries that people move to, because the rich countries aren't making enough babies, and they need the labor and energy of the new migrants. They need them to pay into their social security systems. It's good for the migrants themselves. For many of them, it's literally a matter of life or death. And it's good for the countries that they move from, because remittances, the money that these people send back in $100, $200 increments, are the best and most targeted way of helping the global poor. Remittances last year amounted to 4 times all the foreign aid that was sent to the poor countries, and 100 times the amount of all debt relief. So, the message for my book is, I'm not calling for open borders, I'm calling for open hearts.
Okay, Tatiana.
Do you want to go next? So I'm going to lighten things up and talk about climate change. So my book, which is not yet for sale, but you can pre-order it today, It's called Inconspicuous Consumption, and I wanted to write about sort of the impacts of our everyday stuff, and the ways that they connect to global climate change, to people in other parts of the world, and sort of involve us all in this story in ways that we are not aware of, and can't even imagine. And so I'm very, I think it connects to, to what you're talking about with, the West sort of taking wealth away from other countries, because, we have those same impacts with all of our stuff. So I wrote about the internet, food, fashion, and fuel, and I'll give an example of the way that we're all sort of connected without thinking about it. So one of the things that I wrote about in my book was cheap cashmere, which you don't need today, but someday. So most cashmere comes from Mongolia and China, and that part of the world is experiencing climate change at a faster and more dramatic rate than most of the rest of the world because of how far north it is. So the desert is growing, the forests are dying, and there's less water. In addition to that, there's an enormous appetite for cashmere in the West, and to be able to buy it cheaply. So there's a huge increase of goats, the cashmere goats, over the last 30 years. And the goats have really sharp hooves. And every single thing that I read about them, they were described as having stiletto hooves. But so they break up the soil with their hooves, and then they eat the grass and they pull it up by the roots. And so the soil becomes very unstable. And when the winds come, which they do in that part of the world, it adds to the desert. And so the desert is growing in Mongolia and parts of China at a rate of 950 square miles a year, which is like the size of Rhode Island. So that, so there's that. Then all of that dust, when there are big storms at certain times of the year, take all of that sand and blow it to Beijing, where it combines with the pollution from their coal-fired power plants and factories. So it adds to air pollution in Beijing. And then it comes across the ocean to the west coast of the United States, and adds at least, or if, government officials say they can attribute at least one day of bad air quality to pollution from China and from Mongolia. So when you buy your cashmere sweater, it's not just you buying a cashmere sweater. This is a problem that, that connects all of us, and we think that, it's just about us and what we want, and we have to kind of imagine these bigger global systems that we're all a part of in a world that has been shaped by forces like colonialism and globalism and trade deals and all that sorts of things. So, so that's one thing that I wrote about, but there are many others.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'll come back and talk a little bit about this connection between the individual action and the global effect, and also the global response. But David does a fabulous job in actually bridging both in his book. So why don't you provide us with an overview?
Yeah, I sort of took an opposite perspective that Tatiana did in her little spiel and in her great book, which is to say I started from the quite global level. And the opening line of my book gives you a sense of my perspective on that. The line is, it is worse, much worse than you think. What I meant by that is really, I guess, that it was a lot worse than I thought. One of the sort of buried strains of my book is my own story. I'm not somebody who has ever thought of himself as an environmentalist. I'm a lifelong New Yorker. Not really like a nature lover, never owned any pets. And yet, I've had this incredible awakening over the last couple of years, which is far too late and an embarrassment to me that it happened to me so late, but which felt really profound to me. And that, at its core, is that I had felt until a few years ago that I lived in the modern world, and the modern world was a fortress against the forces of nature. And the more that I learned about climate change and how much it's transforming every aspect of life on the planet, the more I understood that, this was not a threat that could be compartmentalized or escaped. It was the theater in which all of us conduct all of our lives, and when the planet's climate was transformed, all of our lives would be transformed as well, which is to say, in most cases, deformed. And I came to think of my own misunderstandings, which I also thought were sort of representative of the basic, engaged but complacent American liberal, as having sort of three components. The first was about the speed of change, climate change. I was raised to think of this as a really slow process. James Hansen, who's one of the most outspoken climate scientists, he's often called an alarmist. His book for a general audience is called Storms of My Grandchildren. And that was the timeline that I understood this would be happening on for all of my adult life. In fact, half of all of the emissions that we've produced in the entire history of humanity have come in just the last 30 years, which means that since Al Gore published his first book on warming, it's since the UN established the IPCC, its climate change body, it's since the premiere of Seinfeld, and it's since I was born, which means that my life contains really the entire story of the climate crisis. When I was born in 1982, the planet's climate was stable. It is now on the brink of catastrophe, and that is because of what we have done in those 30 years. We often have a tendency to think that we are doing cleanup work for centuries of pollution. But if we had stabilized our emissions at 1992 levels, we'd be in much, much better shape than we are today. The fact that we're dealing with a crisis at the scale that we're dealing with unprecedented extreme weather, wildfires burning through California at unheard of rates, famines, droughts, refugee crises, that's because of what we've done in my lifetime, and as a sort of relatively well-off person in the wealthy West, I have to say, in my name. So that was the first big thing, was about the speed of change. The second was about the scope of change. I heard so much about sea level rise when I was a kid. I thought that was the whole problem. And that meant that if I lived anywhere but the coast, I could escape climate change. First of all, sea level rise is going to happen over centuries, so it's probably the least worrying of all the threats, even though it could be quite dramatic. But the more I learned about the economic impacts, which could mean a 30% smaller global GDP by 2100, that's an impact that is twice as deep as the Great Depression, and it would be permanent. Could have $600 trillion in climate damages, which is equal to twice all the wealth that exists in the world today. To impacts on agriculture, where grain yields could be 50% as bountiful as they are today, we'd be using them to be 50% more people. To impacts on public health, where mosquitoes that used to fly only in the tropics carrying malaria and dengue will now be carrying them as far north as the Arctic Circle. To direct heat impacts, which as soon as 2050 could make many of the biggest cities in the Middle East and South Asia unlivably hot in summer. These are cities that have 10, 12, 15 million people in them, and you wouldn't be able to walk around outside without risking heat stroke or possibly death in summer, which is one reason why the UN thinks we could have as many as 200 million climate refugees by just 2050. I think it's possible we could have as many as 1 billion, which is as many people as today live in North and South America combined. I think those numbers are a bit high, but that's what the UN says. The more you sort of sit with this research, you realize that this is not a story that is compartmentalizable or escapable no matter where you are, no matter how rich you are. It is an all-encompassing story that will touch every life on the planet in some way, and in almost all ways badly. And then the third is just about the severity of change, which, I heard a lot about 2 degrees of warming, which is what scientists of the world call the threshold of catastrophe. Island nations of the world call it genocide. And I heard enough about it to think that probably was a worst-case scenario. But practically speaking, it's about our best-case scenario. We're on track, according to the UN, for over 4 degrees of warming this century, which could mean twice as much war as we have today, because there's a relationship between temperature and conflict. It would mean 6 places on the planet could be hit by 6 climate-driven natural disasters at once. The world that we're heading for is so different from the world that we live in today that it will not just touch the way we grow our crops, the way we fight our wildfires. It will transform our politics, our culture, our relationship to capitalism, our sense of our place in nature and in history. And my book is an effort to reckon with all of those forces, to take stock of the science, but then to try to explore what it would mean for all of us to be living in a world that's transformed by those impacts, because we already are, and the impacts are only going to get more intense over the next couple of decades. We have about 3 decades, the UN says, to take action to really avert some truly catastrophic impacts. But it's quite likely that the course of the century will be shaped quite profoundly by climate change in much the same way that, say, the 19th century was shaped by the forces of modernity, or the late 20th century by financial capitalism. That is how profound this story is and how far-reaching it is. And I think we've only just begun to sort of sort through and think about what it will mean for all of us and our children to be living in that degraded planet, trying to make meaning and prosperity for ourselves in a world that is supportive of so much less of it.
Thanks. So, as you could hear from these descriptions, these books are kind of each one is a kind of tour de force in laying out major problems and major challenges, and articulating their complexities and the interrelationships of the history of factors that have led us to this situation, whether it's in deep time or more recently, as we just heard from David, and the interactions of nature and natural and human systems, and the dynamics that bring them together. So we've got these tremendously challenging and complex problems within each of the books, and this is not a big part of any of the books, but within each, there are statements and directions towards the future and solutions to address each. And so I'm hoping that maybe starting with David and then coming this way, you could articulate those and what the barriers are.
That's a big question. My own feeling is that this picture of the world that I just sketched out, which is really bleak, is ultimately an empowering message because it reflects just how much control we have over the planet and its climate. We're not going to get to 4 degrees warming by the end of the century by inaction. We'll only get there if we make it happen through the choices that we make from here on out. Our hands are on the levers. We are writing the story ourselves, and we can choose to write a different story. There are huge obstacles to that, but they are human obstacles. Science is not an obstacle, and frankly, the technology is not an obstacle either. We basically have the tools today to decarbonize at a rate that would allow us to avoid almost all of the really intense impacts from climate change. The reason we won't is because we don't have a politics or a geopolitics or an economy or a political economy or yet the cultural and grassroots political will to really put those tools into action. Those challenges are different around the world. Different countries face different amounts of climate denial, climate complacency, the sort of capture of policymaking by the fossil fuel interests. But they are also basically familiar to us all because honestly, all of us are too complacent about this issue ourselves in our own individual lives. This is one of the things that Tatiana writes so well about. Even those of us who feel quite, and I would count myself among them, I don't mean to be holier than thou at all, even those of us who are quite concerned about the future of the planet tend to operate in ways that are making that future worse and not taking the opportunity that sits before us to really change the course of our planet's history. And on some level, I find that failure kind of confusing and distressing because the opportunity here is to secure a livable, prosperous, fulfilling life for all future generations of humanity. Having done damage to bring that into question in such a short amount of time that the same people who are responsible for that damage are now in positions where they can do something about it. So much of the narrative around climate change is around impotence and the feeling that this is beyond our control. But the recent history and the near future shows us that we are not just we're not just living the story, we are the protagonists of this story. And in fact, it's a story that we used to only recognize in mythology and theology. We are holding the fate of the planet in our hands and can take the planet in one direction or another, should we choose. I think we're beginning to see a lot of political action around climate just over the last year, and that's been really exciting, especially at the grassroots level. But we haven't yet seen a lot of policy changes, and that's really distressing because, as the UN says, we have only a decade to really meaningfully change course. We have to have our emissions by 2030. And the practical obstacles there are quite large. We have to rebuild all of our infrastructure, reimagine our agriculture, invent a new kind of plane that will fly on a different kind of fuel, in addition to electricity production. A lot of these projects are going to take at least a decade themselves. So if we're really serious about changing course, we need to be putting into place policy today that will enact those changes over the course of the decade. And unfortunately, while our politics is moving very much in the right direction, time is moving in the wrong direction. And I think ultimately that's the precious resource. We need to be moving much, much faster, much, much more aggressively in just about every area on every front. But there's no reason we can't.
Thanks. So, Tatiana, in a sense, one of the challenges that your book articulates is how do we self-inform? And you come up with some interesting observations that I think come from two different directions, but how would you go forward and address the issue that you articulate?
Yeah, so it's one of the things that was challenging in writing my book was, to explain the impacts of our stuff and our kind of the lack of power, relatively speaking, that we have as individuals in terms of things like, does recycling make a difference? Or if I take one fewer flight a year, does that matter? And so that was a tricky balance to strike because I wanted to explain that these are really big systems that involve all of us. And so it's not necessarily about me as an individual. It's kind of how we got to the point where where our pollution is unaccounted for, and we don't nobody pays for the costs of waste and pollution. And David outlined so many of the challenges, but so one of the things I wanted to do in my book was to explain why this is so difficult and how big these systems are and how entrenched they are, because reforming agriculture isn't just about it's about the fossil fuel industry because they make fertilizer, and it's about water pollution and regulation, and it's about farmers, and it's about people who work in meat processing and food processing plants and factories and grocery stores and packaging. And so it involves all these different kinds of things. And so understanding how those things work together, I think the goal of my book is to inform readers so that they can understand when someone is proposing a way to reform the agriculture industry, whether that's actually what needs to happen, and to be able to hold people in power accountable to that. So the main solution that I offer is to vote in terms of individual action, because it's not enough at this point for politicians to say that they believe in climate change. It's not a question of belief. And so, we need to have people in there who are doing the right things, enacting the policies that we need, shifting the conversation away from is this real or is this not, to how do we fix it, or what do we do to make it less horrible. But, in terms of the power that we have as consumers, if government is not regulating the companies, we can do that with the things that we buy. And if companies are not transparent about their practices, it shouldn't be up to the consumer to figure out, okay, this pair of jeans, for instance, a pair of jeans on average uses 1,900 gallons of water to produce. So if a company is not making active efforts to reduce the amount of water, it shouldn't be up to the consumer to figure out, okay, does this pair of jeans use less water than that one? They should all be using less water. And so if they're not, willing to tell us what they're doing, then we don't have to support them. So we do have power in that way in terms of, how we vote and what we buy. Did that answer the question?
Great, thank you. And then, so David does a wonderful job of articulating that we get distracted by a lot of issues. The one that people on Martha's Vineyard would be familiar with is, say, plastic bags. So plastic bags are important, or plastic in the ocean is very important, but it isn't the source of climate change. So you do the same kind of thing because there are so many issues wrapped up in migration and immigration, and people are so fixated on particular parts of that system and the response to it. Where are the answers?
Yeah. So if you speak to economists, most economists, there's almost a universal consensus that immigration is good for the economy. I mean, if the United States were to triple its immigration intake from 1 million to 3 million, like Canada is doing, then our GDP would rise by 2.6%. The economy would gain $15.5 trillion over the next 14 years. Trump wants the GDP to get to 4%. Easy. Let in 8 million immigrants. I should suggest it to him. But the problem is that at its core, the immigration debate isn't about numbers. It's about sentiment or emotion. People think that these people coming in they won't assimilate, they're from a different culture. So ultimately, it's a contest of storytelling. Trump's idea of immigrants is that they're robbers, they're rapists, they're drug dealers, they're coming here to take and not to give. I call them ordinary heroes, and I have personal experience of this. So I grew up in Queens, just like Donald Trump, in the neighborhood of Jackson Heights in Queens, which is, by some accounts, the most diverse neighborhood in the United States. There's some 200 languages spoken in just that one zip code, 11372, where I grew up. And I grew up in a building, when I got there in 1977, filled with Indians and Pakistanis, Dominicans, Haitians. There were Jews, there were Muslims, there were Russians, there were Chinese. The building was owned by a Turkish man, but he'd hired a Greek super. These were all people who'd been killing each other just before they got on the plane. And here we were living next to each other, and Indians and Pakistanis discovered that we like samosas more than we hate each other's armies. So we hung out together, we exchanged foods, our kids dated each other. It's not that we stopped hating each other. We all said horribly racist things about everyone else when we went inside our homes. But we formed a sort of a modus vivendi. And it's interesting that in places like New York, there's very little ethnic conflict left. Think about the last time there was an ethnic riot in New York City. It was in the 1990s. New York, London, Toronto, Sydney, these are all cities that demonstrate that immigration works. They've never been so multicultural. 2 out of 3 New Yorkers are immigrants or their children right now. And New York's never been richer or more prosperous or safer. I grew up in a New York that was not safe, and it's now incredibly safe. It's really hard to get mugged in New York today. But New York is the thing that, many of Trump's followers are taught to hate. This is the modern day Sodom and Gomorrah, because here are all these people who are different. If you look around the world, the people that have everyday lived experience of immigrants are the ones that vote for pro-immigrant parties. So let's take a look at the UK. The people that voted for Brexit, by and large, did not live in London. They live in the English countryside. They're largely white British people, English people, not so much Scottish people. And they voted for the biggest own goal in British history out of fear of immigrants. People in London overwhelmingly voted to remain. And this is something else that I say in my book, that fear of migrants is doing incalculably greater damage to Western countries than the migrants themselves ever could. And if you look at immigrants as ordinary heroes who just want the same thing that you and I want, a better life for our kids. And I saw this firsthand when I went to the Tijuana camps, where there were all these Latinos coming in, and I spoke to these mothers with kids. I spoke to a young Honduran mother who was fleeing the gangs with her little kid, who was 18 months old. And I said to her, she was going to ask for asylum. I said, you know, they're going to take your baby away from you, and they'll put your baby in some camp thousands of miles away. And she had tears in her eyes, and she said, you know what a mother's love is? This baby that I love more than my own life, I would rather never see him again and know that he was safe somewhere, even if it's in some refugee jail, and know that he's alive, than have to put him 6 feet below the ground where I came from. So this, I think if we tell the story of immigrants as ordinary heroes, which they are, the vast majority of them, that's what they are. And if we convince people of that story, then really that's the way to win the fight and to stop Trump from getting reelected.
One thing I would sort of just add briefly to that is that it's also a matter, I think, of talking about it in the terms that you talk about it in, which is to say positive sum, systems that we have, not just in the U.S., but really around the world, a sort of rising tide of zero-sum thinking about politics in which it's relatively easy for someone to think, not that I will benefit from more immigrants who are going to be, energizing the economy in which I live, but that there's a sort of fixed amount of goods here that they're going to be taking. And one of the things I worry about a lot when it comes to climate change is not just the impacts that are going to get worse on and put pressure on populations in the global south, requiring them to move more, but that there will be a growing sense of resource scarcity in the wealthy countries of the world that will make it easier and easier for us to fall into zero-sum thinking about our place in among the community of nations, and make us harder-hearted when it comes to those in need, because we feel we owe it to ourselves to look out for number one first.
Well, that's interesting also because, just to build on what David is saying, because climate change, affects people in unequal ways. So as we've heard, people from Bangladesh who've contributed barely anything to the global greenhouse gas emissions will be affected much more dramatically than people in many parts of the United States. But climate change also exacerbates inequality because it concentrates those effects in certain places, but it also, as David is saying, people who are able to protect themselves will protect themselves. And we were actually on a panel with Rihanna Gunright, who is the policy director for New Consensus, and they wrote the Green New Deal. And she was saying that it allows people to build fortresses around themselves, where they protect themselves from climate change and take things away from people who are already suffering. So I think that's a really important thing to remember is that these systems don't fix themselves, and protecting yourself means that somebody else is left unprotected.
So before we open it up to questions from the audience, are there any other questions among the panelists or comments that you would like to make follow up on each other's remarks?
Well, I'd like to ask both Tatiana and David that I've been reading all these different estimates of what we can do, when we can do, and how is it already too late. The UN just came out with a report that we've got, a couple of years left, 12, and then there was, there was an article in Vox which said it's actually a few weeks. So I'd like to ask both of you, realistically, what can be done, and with the current political climate where we've got a president who thinks climate change is a Chinese-made hoax. What if you had to make a prediction, if you had to look over the next decade, are we going to do this or not?
Not to be so much of a annoying panelist, but I sort of reject the premise of the question in the sense that really with everything on climate, we have a tendency to see things in binary terms. And the truth is, crossing 2 degrees of warming, the threshold of catastrophe, is in itself not especially dramatic. It's a matter of if we get to 2.1 or 2.3 or 2.7 or 2.9, it's not a matter of solving this or being defeated by it. It's not a matter of, implementing a Green New Deal or failing to. Just about at every level, the dynamics are much more complicated and nuanced. And every degree of warming that we create is going to create some additional amount of additional suffering. Every tick upward of warming that we can avoid will avoid some amount of suffering. And I think to the extent that we can hold that idea in our minds, which is a little complicated, it's really important to, because we don't want to get to a situation where, because things are moving along in a bad direction, we give up on the prospect of any hope or progress at all. I think almost certainly we're going to cross 2 degrees. I think basically that's about our best case scenario. And just to give you a sense of how bad that would be, there's a paper I write about in my book that says that just the difference between 1.5 degrees and 2 degrees of warming, just through air pollution, so through one impact, 153 million additional people would die. That's dying at the scale of 25 Holocausts. And that's, I think, essentially baked in. But we're on track for 4.3 degrees of warming, and for me, that's a much more reasonable baseline of expectation. If you're hoping to preserve the climate as it is today, I think there's basically no hope of that. But if you're hoping to make a lot of progress off of 4.3 degrees, I think we can do quite a lot and probably will do quite a lot. The market forces are actually quite strong in this area. Renewable energy is often thought to be a much bigger part of the problem than it is. Electricity is really only about 1/3 or 40% of the global carbon problem. But renewable energy is making that sector quite solvable in the relatively short term. Some of the other sectors, industry, infrastructure, agriculture, transportation, are more complicated, but there's progress there too. The question is whether we have the political will and political economy that can really put the tools we have into place. And to give you a sense of just what that means, the IMF, which is no lefty green organization, recently estimated that globally we're subsidizing the fossil fuel business to the tune of $5.3 trillion a year. It was estimated last week that we could accelerate and put into place a totally renewable economy at the cost of between 10 and 30% of those subsidies. So we wouldn't even have to completely eliminate the fossil fuel subsidies that we're paying globally. We just have to direct 30% of them towards green areas in order to bring about the changes that we're hoping for. I haven't looked into the details of that study. I don't know how diluted those projections are. But we are every day making choices to prioritize the system we have, which is toxic, particularly in the way that we're propping up the fossil fuel business, but in many other ways as well. And we could tomorrow choose to do otherwise. How we make those choices it happens at the community level, it happens at the national level. The part of the problem that I'm personally most worried about is the global level, which is, every nation aside from the US and China basically has a trivial impact on carbon emissions. And that means that they could do everything in their power that they could do, and yet the climate future they'd be living in would be about the same if nobody else does anything, if nobody else joins the cause. But on that front, I think there's been some actually really encouraging news recently in that it's now estimated that Chinese emissions could peak about a decade earlier than was previously estimated. And China's responsible at the moment, the U.S. is responsible for the lion's share of historical emissions. We have a moral obligation to take action as a result. But today and going forward, China is really the main driver of the story. They're responsible for about 28 or 29% of emissions. And that doesn't account for any of the infrastructure work they're building across South Asia and Africa as part of their Belt and Road Initiative, which is like they're building the whole infrastructure of the world at the moment. If cement were a country, it would be the 3rd biggest emitter in the world. And China's now pouring more cement every 3 years than the U.S. poured in the entire 20th century. But it seems to be moving in the right direction. And if they are moving in the right direction, then that's probably the best news that we've had since the Paris Accords, which, by the way, have totally failed.
So, thanks very much. We have 3 or 4 minutes left, and time for a couple of these brief questions.
Hi, I'd like to ask the panel about the idea of a green finger. So in case you haven't heard of this, it's a climate science theory that the only way to realistically cut off global catastrophe is if a private individual or nation takes it upon themselves to basically populate the entire Earth's atmosphere with small crystalline particles that would have a global cooling effect. So considering the current political climate around the world, do you think that this could be one of the few options to actually avoid catastrophe?
I think human geoengineering is a very dangerous idea. There are lots of different people have lots of different theories about how we might do that, but I think we also don't know what the other effects of putting all of those things in the atmosphere might be. And so, personally, I'm not somebody who counts on technological solutions in the future as a reason to keep emitting in the present. So that's not a solution that I would favor, but maybe that billionaire would like to do it anyway.
So
There are a lot of scientists who say that it's inevitable because it's so much cheaper than some of the other solutions, but there has been very little research done about, as you were saying, about a lot of the downstream effects, although Harvard just set up an ethics committee to look into this last week. But I would just say, big picture, actually we are already doing this. The pollution that we're putting into the atmosphere from the burning of fossil fuels is already suppressing global temperatures by at least a half a degree and possibly a full degree. So when I mentioned that 153 million people who would die of air pollution, already today 9 million people are dying every year from air pollution, which is horrifying. But if we cleaned up that air and saved those 9 million lives, we might be adding as much as a full degree Celsius of warming to the planet right now, which would put us already well past the threshold of catastrophe, and bring about many of the more intense heat effects that we've been talking about.
okay.
I'll make this fast. For all of you, when you think in the biggest terms on this, which obviously you do, to what extent do you find yourselves sometimes believing in a catastrophe theory of history? That is, that the only way our species may really, truly act is if we have catastrophes we have not yet seen. That's a horrible thing to contemplate, but there's some evidence that through time.
I would just say I think our theory of history, which since at least the end of the Cold War has been conventionally a theory of reliable if erratic progress, is very much under threat from climate change. I think one of the ways that could change is that we adapt some model like you think, like you were proposing. I think wondering if in our dark nights of the soul we entertain those thoughts. And I do hear from a lot of people who say, what's it going to take to shake us into action? What kind of total meltdown is it going to take? I often think, well, we had Katrina, we had Sandy, we've had unprecedented California wildfires, we've had famines and droughts, we've had the Syrian refugee crisis. A lot of people who study this say that the entire phenomenon of Islamic fundamentalism and terrorism that's emerged in the Middle East over the last couple of decades has been a result of climate conditions, at least partially. We've had a lot of things, a lot of features of the natural world just yelling at us and telling us to wake up, and we haven't yet woken up. So I sometimes think it's going to take a sequence of catastrophes rather than a single one. But I think, I did reporting this past spring in California where I was talking to people who met one woman in Malibu who lived through 9 fires. And they almost all said to me, I came to them and said, I'm a New Yorker, I don't understand how you can live in this kind of environment. And they said, oh, we've always had fires. And I said, no, but, last year's was twice as bad as any in LA before. We're going to have at least twice and maybe 4 times as many by the middle of the century. After that, scientists don't know what's coming because the state will be so burned over they can't predict what will grow back in its place and how flammable that land will be. And they were just like, we've always had fire. And I think we have a real capacity to normalize enormous amounts of suffering. I think that's one lesson of the facts I was mentioning about air pollution, which are already killing 9 million people a year. Very few of us in this tent are quite concerned about that or focus our lives on that fact. And I think that it's likelier that we find ourselves in a world where we're just normalizing to more and more suffering, redefining redefining what counts as unlivable, and living in worlds that we, a generation before, would have found completely inhospitable to one another. But I also think we could adapt a model of history in which we stop thinking of progress as a feature of human life. Economic growth is really only a 200-year-old history, and climate change could conceivably wipe it away from our future. If we remove the theory of reliable economic growth from our sense of what progress history brings, I don't really know what's left, actually. So I think there are going to be some quite profound perturbations to the way that we understand our place in the world and our relationship to history and nature coming quite soon.
So let me take one more question, quick answers, and unfortunately we will have to call it to a close at that point.
Okay, so I saw you interviewed, I think, on Democracy Now! I was very impressed. I already have your book. So I just want to say thank you.
Speak into the microphone.
Oh, I just want to say thank you because...
Thank them, too. They wrote great books, too.
Well, I'm getting to them. And I'm very excited about your book, and I'm very excited about your concept of trying to get the little... Because I feel like that. I feel very, very concerned about this problem. But I don't really feel like I have a lot of power. So I'm very excited about your book, so thank you. And as far as you, I really am happy about your book, too. And I think that this is just a little idea of mine, but I feel like that we need to change the narrative when it comes to immigration. Everybody, including us wimpy little Democrats, are worried about terrorists crossing our border, immigrating into our country. That's not what was happening. And I think Donald Trump has gotten us all riled up about immigrants because everybody has this little fear about terrorism and terrorists coming into our country. And I think as Democrats, we need to make that, illustrate that point.
Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you very much. You finish.
Yeah, I just want to respond to that. You're so right. This narrative, for example, about terrorism. The vast majority of the terror attacks in this country after 9/11 weren't created by dark bearded men coming from the Middle East. They were committed by white boys. White supremacist terrorism accounts for some 79% of the terror incidents in the country since 9/11. So it's a matter of narrative. Like all these populists around the world, Trump, Erdogan in Turkey, Putin, Duterte in the Philippines, Bolsonaro in Brazil. A populist is essentially a gifted storyteller. He's someone who can tell a false story well. The way to fight him is by telling the true story better. This is why we come to literary events like this.
So that's... Thanks very much for ending it that way. This is a series of books which tell those stories from the very personal to the global in a fabulous way. So thanks to all three of you for entertaining my questions and the others, and please go buy their books. Thanks for coming.
Thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you, everyone.